left for dead by the man she trusted. Lydia clawed her way behind a freezing waterfall to await what she assumed would be a cold grave. Every breath felt like swallowing crushed glass in the 20 below zero air, while the gale outside screamed its fury. But instead of death, the darkness hiding within the stone offered an impossible miracle. The Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho do not forgive mistakes. They are a jagged, towering expanse of ancient granite and dense pine, beautiful in the summer, but merciless in late November. For 28-year-old Lydia Hayes, this trip was supposed to be a reset. A weekend getaway to mend a fractured relationship with her fiancé, Derek Whitmore. Instead, it became the prologue to a nightmare. Derek had always been a man of intense, suffocating control. Over the past 3 years, Lydia had watched his charm curdle into possessiveness, isolating her from friends and dictating her finances. She had finally gathered the courage to leave him. Tucked inside the inner pocket of her insulated North Face jacket was a signed lease for an apartment in Boise, her escape plan, scheduled to begin the moment they returned to civilization. But Derek found the folded paper while looking for the truck's registration in her coat earlier that morning. He said nothing at the time. He just smiled, a tight, cold expression, and suggested they take his modified Ford Bronco up a remote logging road near Trapper Peak for one last romantic off-grid hike before the predicted winter storm rolled in. By 2:00 p.m., the sky above the tree line bruised into a deep, violently purplish gray. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in 20 minutes. Lydia, sitting in the passenger seat of the idling Bronco, looked nervously at the heavy snowflakes beginning to stick to the windshield. They were 15 miles from the nearest paved highway, parked at the end of a dead-end dirt track, surrounded by towering, silent Douglas firs. "Derek, we need to turn around," Lydia said, her voice tight with anxiety. "The radio said this front is moving faster than expected. They're calling it a historic blizzard." Derek turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening, save for the soft tap-tap-tap of ice pellets hitting the glass. He turned to her, his eyes devoid of any warmth. Slowly, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out the crumpled lease agreement. "Boise, huh?" he whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "A one-bedroom on Maple Street, starting on the 1st of the month." Lydia's heart slammed against her ribs. "Derek, I can explain." "Get out," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a guttural command. "What? Derek, no, it's freezing. Don't do this." Before she could unbuckle her seatbelt, Derek lunged across the center console. He shoved his shoulder into her chest, popped her door open, and violently shoved her outward. Lydia tumbled out of the high-lifted truck, hitting the frozen, rutted mud with a sickening thud. The breath left her lungs in a sharp rush. She scrambled to her hands and knees, the wet snow instantly soaking through her denim jeans. "My pack!" she screamed, lunging for the open door. Her survival gear, extra layers, satellite phone, and food were all in the heavy canvas bag sitting on the floorboard. Derek slammed the heavy steel door shut in her face. The lock clicked. He rolled down the window just an inch. "You want to be independent, Lydia? Start now. Let's see how well you survive on your own." "Derek, you're going to kill me! Open the door!" She beat her bare fists against the tinted glass, tears of sheer panic instantly freezing on her eyelashes. The Bronco's engine roared to life. Tires spun, kicking up a rooster tail of icy mud that splattered across Lydia's face and chest. She stumbled back as the heavy vehicle lurched forward, swung around in the tight clearing, and accelerated down the narrow logging road. Lydia stood paralyzed in the tire tracks, watching the red taillights disappear around a bend of heavy timber. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifyingly vast. She was alone. She had no hat, no gloves, no food, and no shelter. She was wearing a medium-weight jacket, a flannel shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. In her pockets, she had half a pack of spearmint gum, a tube of chapstick, and a dead cell phone. Overhead, the sky broke open. The gentle snowfall transformed into a blinding, horizontal curtain of white. The great bitterroot blizzard of 2018 had officially arrived. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized Lydia's throat. She began to run down the road, following the rapidly disappearing tire tracks. "Come back!" she screamed into the wind, the sound snatched away instantly by the roaring gale. "Please!" She ran until her lungs burned, her boots slipping on the slick, accumulating ice. After a mile, the adrenaline spiked, leaving her exhausted and trembling violently. The tire tracks were completely filled in by the heavy, driving snow. Whiteout conditions had set in. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The temperature was now hovering near zero, and the wind chill was pushing it down to -20. Survival psychology dictates that a person has about 3 hours to find shelter in extreme weather before hypothermia becomes fatal. Lydia didn't have 3 hours. Her clothes were inadequate, and the moisture from her earlier fall was wicking away her body heat at an alarming rate. "I am going to die here," she thought, the realization hitting her with the weight of a physical blow. He murdered me. He just used the weather to do it. But as she stood shivering in the blinding white, a profound, fiery anger began to replace the despair. Derek wanted her to die. He expected her to curl up in a snowbank and fade away. The sheer spite of not wanting to give him the satisfaction ignited a tiny, desperate furnace in her chest. She forced herself to move. Staying on the logging road was suicide. The wind was funneling down the open path like a wind tunnel, stripping away her core temperature. She needed a windbreak. She remembered a topographical map Derek had shown her in the truck. About 2 miles from where they had parked, there was a deep gorge that cut through the mountain, fed by a steep creek. If she could get down into the gorge, she might escape the worst of the wind. Lydia veered off the road and plunged into the dense tree line, beginning a treacherous descent into the unknown. The descent into the gorge was a nightmare of stumbling, falling, and agonizing cold. The snow was now thigh-deep in places, hiding fallen logs and jagged rocks. Lydia lost feeling in her fingers and toes within the first hour. Her hands were curled into rigid, useless claws, tucked deep into her armpits in a futile attempt to keep them warm. The initial violent shivering that had racked her body was beginning to subside. She knew enough about wilderness survival to understand that this was a terrible sign. When the shivering stops, the body is giving up. The blood is pooling in the core, sacrificing the extremities. Next comes confusion, apathy, and the overwhelming desire to just sit down and sleep. Keep moving. Keep moving. Keep moving. She chanted the words aloud, though her lips were so numb they slurred the syllables. The wind howled through the upper canopy of the pines, sounding like a freight train. But down here in the steep ravine, the air was surprisingly still. The trade-off, however, was the terrain. The ground sloped at a sharp 40-degree angle, Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her boots. Lydia slid on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the powder, tumbling uncontrollably down a steep embankment. She crashed through a thicket of dead brush, thorny branches tearing at her face and jacket, before slamming hard into a flat, icy surface. She lay there for a long time, staring up at the grey sky through the skeletal branches. The pain in her ribs was sharp, but the cold was a heavy, suffocating blanket dragging her down into sleep. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. Then she heard it. Beneath the howling wind, a low, rhythmic roaring sound echoed off the canyon walls. Water. Moving water. Lydia forced her eyes open and rolled onto her side. She was lying on the frozen edge of a creek bed. She pushed herself up on her forearms, groaning as her bruised ribs protested. She followed the sound. 50 yards upstream, looming out of the swirling white mist of the storm, was a massive wall of black granite. Plunging down the center of the rock face was a spectacular, terrifying waterfall. It was Blackstone Falls. The water was half frozen, creating massive, cathedral-like pillars of blue and white ice, but a heavy torrent still roared down the center, plunging into a deep, churning pool surrounded by a shelf of thick ice. Lydia staggered toward it, drawn by some primal instinct. The sheer rock walls surrounding the falls offered an overhang, a natural roof that might block the falling snow. But as she drew closer, the spray from the plunging water hit her face. It was a death sentence. If she got wet, she would freeze solid in minutes. She hugged the edge of the canyon wall, carefully navigating the slippery ice shelf away from the main spray. She needed a dry depression, a cave, anything. She pressed her back against the freezing black granite, shuffling along the wall behind the outer columns of frozen ice. The noise here was deafening, the water thundering just feet away. She was now standing in a narrow gap between the rock face and the back of the waterfall. It was incredibly dark, lit only by the faint, eerie blue light filtering through the thick ice pillars. Her foot caught on a jagged protrusion, and she stumbled sideways, falling hard against the rock wall. But instead of hitting solid stone, her shoulder slipped into empty space. Lydia gasped, scrambling backward. She ran her numb hands over the rock face. There, hidden in the darkest corner behind the roaring curtain of water, was a vertical fissure in the granite. It was barely 2 feet wide, a dark, jagged crack leading straight into the heart of the mountain. The wind violently shifted outside, driving a blast of freezing mist behind the waterfall. Lydia didn't think. She reacted. She turned sideways, sucked in her stomach, and pushed herself into the crevice. The rock scraped against her jacket, catching and tearing the nylon. The space was incredibly tight. Claustrophobia instantly gripped her throat. The rock walls pressed against her chest and back, unyielding and freezing. Complete, absolute darkness swallowed her. She couldn't see her own hand an inch from her face. "I'm going to get stuck," she thought, her breath quickening into a panicked hyperventilation. "I'm going to get wedged in this crack and die in the dark." She tried to back out, but her boot caught on a narrow ledge. The freezing wind howled at her back, biting through the tear in her jacket. The cold outside meant certain death. The darkness ahead was a terrifying gamble. Lydia chose the darkness. She squeezed her eyes shut and pushed forward, leading with her shoulder, scraping her way deeper into the mountain. 1 foot, 2 feet, 5 feet. The roar of the waterfall began to muffle, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing echoing off the tight stone. After about 10 feet, the pressure on her chest suddenly vanished. She stumbled forward, falling to her hands and knees on solid, dry rock. She gasped, pulling greedy lungfuls of air. The air in here was different. It was stale, dry, and distinctly warmer than the sub-zero hell outside. She was in a cavern. She sat up, wrapping her arms around her shivering torso, trying to let her eyes adjust. But there was zero ambient light. It was pitch black. Lydia blindly reached out with her right hand to feel the dimensions of the space. She expected rough, damp cave walls. Instead, her frozen fingers brushed against something smooth, something perfectly straight. It was wood. Her heart skipped a beat. She traced her fingers along the surface. It was a plank. She followed it down and felt a heavy metal hinge. Moving her hand further, her knuckles clanked against something cold, round, and unmistakably man-made. A brass doorknob. Lydia froze in the pitch-black silence of the cave. She wasn't just in a natural rock formation. Deep within a hidden crevice, behind a freezing waterfall, miles from civilization. Someone had built a door. Trembling with a mixture of profound terror and wild, desperate hope, Lydia wrapped her numb fingers around the brass knob and turned. The heavy latch clicked with a sharp, metallic echo that reverberated through the tight stone walls. Lydia pushed, but the door refused to yield. Panic flared in her chest, a wild animal thrashing against the bars of a cage. She threw her frozen shoulder against the wood, her boots slipping on the slick rock floor. Once, twice, and on the third desperate heave, the hinges shrieked a rusted protest. The door swung inward, releasing a puff of incredibly dry, stale air that smelled of ancient dust and old canvas. She stumbled forward over the threshold, falling onto a wooden floorboard. It was still pitch black. Lydia stayed on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She had to think. She had to act before the hypothermia completely shut down her brain. If this was a man-made structure, there had to be a light source. She dragged herself forward, keeping her left hand flat against the rough-hewn wooden wall. After a few feet, her hand bumped into the cold edge of a metal table. She swept her numb fingers across the surface. She felt a heavy, cylindrical object, a lantern. Beside it, a small rectangular cardboard box. She picked up the box. It rattled. Matches. Her fingers were so stiff they felt like blocks of wood. It took her 3 agonizing minutes just to slide the inner tray of the matchbox open. She pulled out a wooden stick, pinched it awkwardly between the heels of her palms, and struck it against the abrasive side. A tiny, miraculous spark flared into a brilliant yellow flame. The sudden light blinded her, making her eyes water violently. As her vision adjusted, the shadows retreated, revealing a sight so impossible she thought her freezing brain was hallucinating. She was in a room, roughly 10 by 15 feet, carved directly out of the mountain's bedrock. Thick wooden beams reinforced the ceiling. Against the far wall sat a heavy cast-iron wood stove, its black exhaust pipe snaking upward into a natural fissure in the rock. To her right were floor-to-ceiling shelves packed tight with mason jars, military-grade MREs, and heavy plastic jugs of water. To her left was a sturdy wooden cot piled high with thick army-green wool blankets. Lydia didn't cry. She was too dehydrated, too close to the edge of death for tears. Instead, A ragged, hysterical laugh escaped her cracked lips. She quickly touched the match to the wick of the kerosene lantern on the table. A warm, golden glow bathed the subterranean bunker. Her priority was heat. She dragged herself to the cast-iron stove. Beside it sat a neatly stacked pile of dry, split cedar logs and a metal bucket of kindling. Her hands shook violently as she loaded the paper and wood, striking another match. When the paper caught and the flames licked the dry cedar, the fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows against the granite walls. Lydia stripped off her soaked, frozen outer jacket and her stiff denim jeans. She wrapped herself in 3 heavy wool blankets from the cot and curled into a tight ball on the floor, directly in front of the stove. Then came the pain. As the intense heat from the iron stove began to thaw her frozen extremities, a terrifying, excruciating agony ripped through her fingers and toes. It felt like her blood was made of boiling acid. She screamed into the empty bunker, biting down on a fold of the wool blanket to keep from biting her own tongue. The thaw is the most painful part of extreme cold exposure, as the damaged capillaries burst and the nerve endings scream back to life. She lay there for hours, writhing in agony, hovering on the border of consciousness, while the blizzard raged unheard outside the thick stone walls. When she finally awoke, the fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The bunker was stiflingly warm. Lydia sat up, her body bruised, her fingers swollen and red, but undeniably alive. She stood on shaky legs and began to explore her sanctuary. On the table, next to the lantern, lay a leather-bound notebook. She opened it, dust falling from the yellowed pages. The handwriting was jagged but precise. September 14, 1998. The excavation is complete. Getting the materials up. Trapper Peak unseen was a brutal endeavor, but the impending collapse of the grid demands absolute secrecy. When the Millennium Bug wipes the slate clean, they will devour each other in the cities. I will be here, safe. Arthur Caldwell. Lydia flipped through the pages. Arthur Caldwell was a Y2K survivalist. He had spent years secretly expanding a natural cave system behind Blackstone Falls, outfitting it to survive the end of the world. The journal detailed everything. How to draft the stove so the smoke filtered invisibly through the upper cave system, how to rotate the canned goods, and how to operate the manual air vent. The last entry was dated December 2004. Chest pains are worsening. The world didn't end, but my time in it is. I'm leaving the sanctuary fully stocked. Perhaps the mountain will need it one day. Thank you, Arthur, Lydia whispered into the silence. She found a manual can opener, a tin of peaches from 1999, and a bottle of surprisingly clear water. The peaches tasted like metallic syrup, but to Lydia, it was a feast of kings. She ate slowly, letting the sugar and calories fuel her depleted body. As she sat on the cot, wrapped in the wool blankets, staring at the glowing embers of the stove, the trauma of the day finally crashed over her. Derek's cold, lifeless eyes, the sound of the lock clicking, the truck driving away. They hadn't just broken her heart. He had calculated her execution. He knew the blizzard was coming. He knew she had no gear. He had weaponized the Bitterroot Mountains to solve his problem. A deep, dark rage began to simmer in Lydia's chest. It was a hotter, more sustaining fire than the one burning in the iron stove. Derek thought she was currently buried under 4 feet of snow, freezing to death in a ditch. I was probably already rehearsing his story for the police. The tragic, unforeseen accident. The devastated fiancé. "I am going to destroy you," she promised the empty room. For 3 days, the great Bitterroot blizzard battered the mountains of Idaho, dropping an unprecedented 60 inches of snow. Inside Arthur Caldwell's tomb, Lydia lived in a suspension of time. She ate ancient canned ravioli, drank filtered water, and slept for 12 hours at a time, allowing her exhausted body to heal. She found an old pair of oversized, insulated Carhartt overalls and a heavy flannel-lined coat in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. They swallowed her frame, but they were incredibly warm. By the morning of the 4th day, the faint, low rumble of the waterfall outside had completely stopped. Lydia put on the oversized winter gear, grabbed a heavy iron pry bar she found leaning against the shelves, and walked to the wooden door. She pulled it open. The narrow crevice was completely dark. The faint blue light that had guided her in was gone. She crept forward, feeling her way along the jagged rock until she reached the entrance. Her hand hit a solid, unyielding wall of ice. The plunging temperatures and the mist from the waterfall had caused the falls to freeze completely solid, effectively sealing the crack in the rock face with a foot of hard-packed blue ice. She was entombed. Panic threatened to rise, but Lydia pushed it down. She was not the same woman who had cowered in the passenger seat of Derek's truck. The mountain had tried to kill her, and she had conquered it. A wall of ice was not going to stop her now. She raised the heavy iron pry bar and swung it like a baseball bat. Crack! Vibrations shot up her arms, stinging her swollen joints, but a jagged spiderweb of white fractures appeared in the blue ice. "I am coming for you, Derek," she grunted, swinging the bar again. She chipped away at the ice wall for 4 grueling hours. Sweat poured down her face in the freezing crevice. Her muscles screamed, and her hands blistered. But she didn't stop. Finally, with a massive 2-handed thrust, the center of the ice wall gave way. A blinding shaft of pure, brilliant sunlight pierced the gloom, accompanied by a rush of crisp, freezing mountain air. Lydia hammered at the edges until the hole was large enough to crawl through. She pushed herself out, tumbling onto the thick snowpack at the base of the frozen waterfall. The storm had broken. The sky was an impossible, piercing blue. The world was utterly silent, buried under 5 feet of pristine, untouched white powder. Equipped with Arthur's heavy winter clothes, Lydia began the brutal hike out of the gorge. The snow was chest-deep in places, requiring her to practically swim through the powder. It took her 6 hours to cover the 2 miles back to the logging road, navigating by the position of the sun and the jagged peaks above. When she finally reached the flat clearing where Derek had abandoned her, the road was impassable for normal vehicles, but a deep set of heavy tread marks indicated a county snowplow had recently pushed through. Lydia followed the plowed track for 3 miles until she heard the deep rumble of a diesel engine. A massive yellow county plow was creeping up the mountain road, widening the lane. Lydia stood in the center of the road, waving her arms. The truck hissed to a halt, and a burly, bearded man in a high-vis jacket hopped out, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Holy hell, lady! Where did you come from?" he shouted, rushing toward her. "I need you to take me to the sheriff's station," Lydia rasped, her voice rough and dry. "Right now." 70 miles away, in the heated, wood-paneled lobby of the Salmon County Sheriff's Office, Derek Whitmore sat hunched over a styrofoam cup of coffee. He was playing the part to perfection. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot from forced tears. Sitting across from him was Sheriff Brody, a stern-faced man with a thick silver moustache, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "I told her not to wander off," Derek said, his voice cracking with rehearsed emotion. "We were just having a small argument. She got out of the truck to cool off, and then the whiteout hit. I searched for her, Sheriff. I honked the horn. I screamed her name for hours, but I couldn't see past my own hood. I had to hike out when the truck got stuck. You have to find her." Sheriff Brody sighed heavily. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll be straight with you. With the temperatures we saw over the last 3 days, and the gear you said she was wearing, this is a recovery mission, not a rescue. We're getting the search dogs and the snowmobiles ready now, but you need to prepare yourself for the worst." Derek buried his face in his hands, hiding the small, triumphant smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was done. He was free, and she had paid the price for trying to leave him. The heavy double doors of the precinct lobby suddenly flew open, letting in a blast of cold air. Derek didn't look up, too busy rubbing his eyes for his performance. But Sheriff Brody stopped talking. The entire precinct seemed to freeze. Derek lowered his hands and turned around. Standing in the doorway was a ghost. She was draped in a massive, dirt-stained Carhartt coat. Her face was smudged with soot, her lips cracked, and her eyes burned with a ferocity that made the hair on the back of Derek's neck stand up. Derek's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a wet smack. Brown liquid splashed across his expensive hiking boots. All the color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. "Lydia," he whispered, the word stumbling out of his mouth like a dry heave. Lydia walked slowly across the lobby, every step deliberate and heavy. She ignored the shocked deputies, ignored the sheriff, and walked right up to the chair where Derek sat paralyzed. She reached into the oversized pocket of the coat and pulled out the crumpled, frozen lease agreement. She dropped it directly onto his lap. "You forgot my bag, Derek," she said, her voice echoing loud and perfectly steady in the dead silent room. "But I made it to moving day anyway." Sheriff Brody stood up, his hand instinctually resting on his duty belt, looking between the terrified man and the woman who had just walked out of a frozen hell. "Ma'am, are you Lydia Hayes?" Lydia didn't break eye contact with Derek. "I am, and I'd like to report an attempted murder." Derek scrambled backward, knocking his chair over, babbling incoherently. "She's crazy. She ran away. I didn't do anything." Lydia watched with cold satisfaction as 2 deputies firmly grabbed Derek by the arms, dragging the protesting, suddenly pathetic man toward the holding cells. The illusion of his power was shattered, broken against the immovable reality of her survival. She had crawled into the dark, expecting a grave. Instead, the mountain had given her a fortress, and Arthur Caldwell had given her the fire. Lydia Hayes didn't just survive the storm. She became it. If Lydia's incredible story of survival and fighting back against the odds kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button right now, share this video with your friends to spread the suspense, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, true-life survival dramas. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What would you do in Lydia's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.